Hi to all of you at the Canadian Human Connection Conference. My name is Gillian Sandstrom. Sorry I couldn't be there live with you today. The time difference hasn't worked out for us, but I'm happy to be here in virtual form to talk a little bit about my research today. So I'm Canadian, but I've been living in the UK for 9 years now, and I have arguably the best job title in the world. I am a senior lecturer in the psychology of kindness, and I'm also the director of the new Sussex Centre for Research on Kindness, which I'll tell you about a little bit at the end of my talk. So I'd like to start by telling you about something called the kindness test. And this was a collaboration between the University of Sussex and BBC Radio 4. It's the largest ever public science project on kindness. We had 60,000 responses from people all around the UK and around the world, including 500 responses from Canada. It covers a huge age range and a giant range of topics as well. Some of the questions we looked at were, what is kindness? Why is kindness important? How has it changed over time? Who is kind? Where are people kind? And what barriers make it difficult to be kind? There's actually surprisingly little research on kindness. So we looked at acts of kindness that people performed, acts of kindness they received, and acts of kindness that they witnessed. So just to start about why kindness is important, we find that people who report receiving more kindness also report more well-being and higher life satisfaction. They report less loneliness, fewer mental health difficulties, and less burnout. Looking at the relationships with people who report being more kind is a tiny bit more complicated. It also has benefits. So being kind has benefits, more well-being and higher life satisfaction. But there's a bit of a caveat, because if you try too hard to be kind to others without being kind to yourself, then it doesn't help protect you from burnout. So we asked people in this survey, what is kindness? Can you tell us about the last time that someone was kind to you? And we asked people where the act of kindness took place and who was the person who was kind to them. And as you can imagine, most of the acts of kindness that people reported were between friends, family members, etc. But I'd like to focus today on the 5,607 acts of kindness that came from strangers. So that's about 10% of the responses. People said the last time someone was kind to them, it was a stranger. And so this is a word cloud of the most common responses. And you can see that many of the most common acts of kindness were small things. I personally love that dog shows up. I carry dog treats so that I can make friends with dogs and their owners. But you can see that people are waiting to hold doors for strangers. They're carrying heavy bags at the supermarket. They're letting cars in front of them on the road, giving up seats on the train, sharing unexpired parking tickets, etc., etc. But also, it includes things like smiling, being friendly, thanking, complimenting, and having a little chat. You can't see it in the word cloud, but there were even a few people who shared stories of receiving hugs from strangers. And this links to the research that I've been doing for the last dozen years. I've been doing research on the benefits of minimal social interaction, so that includes with acquaintances and strangers. And I've also been looking at the barriers to minimal social interactions. Now, when I was a kid growing up in BC, I saw my dad talk to strangers all the time. He went fishing one day, and I don't know what you picture when you think about fishing, but this is my image of fishing, a very solitary activity. Not my dad. My dad came home from fishing and he said, I met your piano teacher's brother today. So I've been seeing this behavior my whole life, and I saw how much my dad enjoyed it and how much the people he talked to enjoyed it as well. I also learned all his tricks and his cheesy lines for starting conversations, especially with kids. But I didn't do it myself. I didn't talk to strangers until I hit my 30s. I'm an introvert. A noisy room full of people is one of my least favorite environments. I'd much rather be home sitting on the couch with my cats, reading a book, or walking at the top of a hill somewhere. But being introverted doesn't mean that I don't like people. That's a common misconception. But I digress a little. One of the first conversations that I remember initiating with a stranger was with a lady on the subway in Toronto. And I talked to her because I couldn't help it. She was carrying this absolutely decadent cupcake. And so I commented on her cupcake and asked her about it. And by the end of our conversation, she had taught me the delightful fact that humans can ride ostriches. So I was hooked, and this had two broad consequences for me. Number one, I became addicted to talking to strangers. So I have had lots of fun talking to strangers ever since then. I've been given free vegetables from someone's allotment garden. On holiday, by following the advice of strangers, I've eaten the best fish and chips in Pembrokeshire, and I've visited places that were not in any tourist guidebook, including a tiki bar in Paris. I have avoided having to take a bus replacement for the train by talking to strangers who offered me a ride. I've met really interesting people, including a theatrical wig maker, a man who helped set up New Year's Eve fireworks in London, children's book author. One day I even talked to a professional cellist on the tube in London, and partly because of that conversation, I started taking cello lessons, and I play with an amateur orchestra now, and making music with others is such a huge joy. I'm so glad I didn't wait for someday, which I might have done if it hadn't been for that stranger. So as a result of the cupcake lady, I became addicted to talking to strangers, but I also started doing research on talking to strangers. And I started by looking at the benefits. And the first benefit I examined was well-being. So I ran two studies. One of the first ones I did during my PhD was a study at Starbucks. And I found that people were in a better mood and felt more connected when they talked to their barista in a more social way instead of an efficient sort of instrumental way. Then I kind of flipped it with a study that I did at the Tate Modern Art Gallery in London. I trained volunteers to approach visitors and start a conversation, and found that the people who were approached also felt in a better mood and felt more connected. More recently, I've been looking at benefits to the community. So personally, although individual interactions with strangers are often fun and informative and heartwarming, they're also often decidedly average. But I think that they still matter because I think they add up to me feeling like I can talk to pretty much anyone and that people are generally okay. So I looked at this in an online study during the first COVID lockdowns. And I had people fill out a survey and make predictions about what it would be like to talk to a stranger online. Then I actually connected them to another participant in the study, not based on any criteria other than which time zone they were in. And after the conversation, which they had to organize themselves, they reported back by filling out another survey. And just for fun, I wanted to mention that people predicted how long their conversation would be with a complete stranger. And they predicted they would talk for about 14 minutes. On average, they talked for 40 minutes, which is just a huge difference. But what I was most excited about in this study was the change in feelings of trust towards other people. So compared to what people thought before their conversation, people showed a massive increase in trust after having a single conversation with a stranger. And that conversation took place anywhere from 1 to 22, but on average 6 days after they filled out that first survey. So people seem to be concluding after having a nice chat with a stranger, you know, maybe people aren't so bad. So I'd like to tell you about one more study that I ran in the classroom. And I ran a study in my classroom. I teach second year undergraduate statistics, and the students would all come to a big lecture, but then they were broken up into different sessions for a computer lab. And I assigned each of those different computer labs to a separate condition. So as teachers, we're often encouraged to learn students' names, but it's really hard when you're teaching 200 students and you're only teaching them for a few weeks. So there was one condition where students displayed a little name board on their desk, and that was to give me a chance to learn their names. But I also had a more minimal condition, which was to stand at the door and greet students as they arrived in class. And finally, the third lab group, unfortunately, had neither of these things. And what I found in this study is that students who either felt that I knew their name or had simply been greeted by me as they arrived in class, all of those students felt more interested and engaged in their class. Now, I know I'm not speaking to a room full of teachers, but there's probably teachers out there. But the reason I think this matters is that it comes down to the benefits of being seen. So I'd like to tell you about a study that I was not involved in, which I think is really clever. So this study had 3 people involved. There was the participant, who in this case was just someone walking around on campus. There was a confederate, which means someone that's pretending not to be, but is actually part of the research team. And then we have the experimenter. And so what would happen is the confederate and the participant would walk past each other, and the confederate sometimes would look at the participant and other times they wouldn't. And the experimenter, because they're standing behind the confederate, didn't know which was the case. So the experimenter would wait until the 2 people passed each other, and then they would stop the participant and ask them to fill out a few questions. And what this study found is that simply making eye contact with someone made them feel more connected. Now, I think this is really powerful because it tells us how important it is to feel like you're being seen and feel welcomed. In the UK, the government is talking a lot about social prescribing as an intervention to address loneliness. And it's all well and good to encourage someone to join a choir, but if the existing choir members don't welcome the new person, I suspect they're unlikely to return. So I feel like we all need to do a better job of looking out for people and welcoming people and showing them that they are seen. So just to summarize so far, I've talked a little bit about benefits to the self. So the Starbucks study, talked about benefits to the person you talked to, which was the Tate study and the classroom study. And then I've talked about benefits to the community with that increased feeling of trust. But despite all these benefits, people tend not to talk to strangers. And I've been trying to figure out what exactly people are afraid of and whether those fears are accurate. So I started by asking people at a series of how to talk to strangers public workshops to tell me about what they were worried about. And I turned that into a sort of a fears inventory. Then in a series of 7 studies, I asked people to report their fears before talking to a stranger. And what we found in this series of studies is that people's fears are just way overblown. People worry a lot more than they need to based on how things actually go during these conversations. But we also found that it's hard to learn from this. So even you'd think that having a nice conversation might make people realize that talking to strangers is not so scary. But people seem to think that a nice conversation is a pleasant exception to an unpleasant rule. So in an attempt to more permanently change attitudes towards talking to strangers, I recently tried to turn it into a game. I used an app to develop a talking to strangers scavenger hunt game. And every day for a week, participants had to choose at least one mission from a list that included things like find someone who's drinking a coffee or find someone who's wearing a hat. And participants were asked to find a person matching this description and then start a conversation with that person. So we also had a control condition in which participants were asked to simply observe people but not talk to them. But I'm not going to talk about that group today. What I wanted to show you was that after talking to strangers for a week, participants were less worried about rejection. So you can see that in the blue line, their predictions became more and more positive over the course of the week. And they became more confident in their ability to carry on a conversation. And it's important to note that these changes occur gradually, day by day. Repetition really seems to matter. So I just wanted to tell you about one more research study that I've done, sort of acknowledging the fact that one barrier to having conversations with strangers might be the feeling that you're dissimilar, that you're different from them. So I ran a study with older and younger adults, and we thought, maybe people would have sort of negative predictions. There's stereotypes on both sides. People might expect that it's hard to find common ground with each other, and they might not be able to see any benefits to talking to someone from the opposite group. On the other hand, we figured that they would have positive experiences because I just showed you lots of data showing that conversations with strangers generally go better than expected. Also, it's possible that older adults may be better at talking to strangers. And people who feel like they might not have anything in common might try even harder to find things that they do have in common. And finally, we thought there might even be some benefits to talking to someone different than you. You might learn more from people who are less like you. So we ran a study where we had younger and older adults. So the younger adults were 25 to 30 years old, and the older adults were 65 to 70 years old. And we had people either talk to someone in their own age group or talk to someone in the opposite age group. And then they reported both before having a conversation. They had a conversation with each other on Zoom for 15 minutes, and then they reported back after the conversation. And what we found was similar to the previous studies, that people enjoyed the conversations more than they predicted, and regardless of who their partner was. So you can see that all the pink bars, which are the actual experiences, are taller than the blue bars. And this was the same for people who had a same generation partner or a cross-generation partner. But you can also see here that older adults, which is the two sets of bars on the right, they actually had more positive predictions and they enjoyed the conversations more than the younger adults. So it might be that they've learned through lots of practice over the years, or it might be that they worry less about how they're judged by others. We don't know, but interesting findings. We also looked at, in this study for the first time, a list of benefits that people might get from talking to someone. And this list was generated through, the list of benefits we chose was generated through conversations with two charity partners whose organizations promote and provide opportunities for these kind of cross-generational conversations. And what we found was that people who talked to a cross-generational partner reported learning something new more often. They reported experiencing a new point of view or perspective and helping their conversation partner experience a new point of view or perspective. So, although we might expect that feeling dissimilar from one's partner poses an extra barrier to connection, these exciting new results show that talking to someone different might provide extra benefits. So just to summarize, I told you about minimal social interactions and how they have benefits for the person who initiates the conversation and the person they talk to, and then society more broadly by increasing a sense of trust. I also showed you how people are reluctant to initiate conversations, how they worry about a lot of different things, but these fears are overblown, and practice really does seem to make perfect. And even talking to someone dissimilar is positive and might have some extra benefits. So returning to the word cloud from the kindness test that I showed you at the beginning, it shows us that it shows us again the acts of kindness received from strangers. And I hope I've convinced you now that minimal social interactions can make a real difference. When we perform these acts, it might feel unimportant, but minimal social interactions are often felt as an act of kindness. And we all have it in our power to be kind by making people feel seen. When we ask people how they felt after receiving an act of kindness, not just from a stranger, any act of kindness, this is what they said. So if you're a bit nervous about talking to strangers, maybe the little nudge you need is to think about how it benefits others. It is perceived as an act of kindness, and it makes people feel wonderful. So the little things can really mean a lot. And when lots of us start to do these things and they become the norm, I believe we can make our world a better place. So just to wrap up, I wanted to promote the new Sussex Center for Research on Kindness. We have a mailing list if you'd like to hear more new research about kindness. We have talks and events that you could join all the way from Canada. And I'll put the contact information up on this last slide. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of the conference today, and I hope you have a wonderful experience.
Hey, everybody. We just finished watching Gillian's incredible talk, her keynote at the Canadian Human Connection Conference. And Gillian, I just want to first say thank you for being here. But number two, I know you couldn't be with us live, but honestly, that was an incredible presentation. And I think you gave a really broad array of research that really helps us understand that connecting with people that we don't know yet can be really valuable for our health. So thank you very much for doing that.
My pleasure.
So I got a few questions that I think that many people in the audience might have as well. And I've written them down here. So, because after I watched it, I really did want to dive deeper into some of the research that you've got. So the first question I've got for you, Gillian, is why do you think that the simple act of speaking with other people isn't really often even considered as kindness, that it's, it's something we take for granted versus, taking muffins over to the neighbor or shoveling snow or taking out the garbage? How come we don't see social connection as kindness?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. And I've been thinking about it a bit, because there's been times recently where I've said something to someone like, oh, that was really kind of you. And they say, oh, no, I wasn't being kind. And so I think saying something in particular is one of those cases where we don't necessarily, we just don't think about it as kindness. And every once in a while you get a reminder that it is. So I know, personally speaking, I think a lot about welcoming. And that's one case where I think saying a few words can really make a huge difference to someone, right? So, when I started playing tennis, which is a long time ago now, I was rubbish. It was terrible. And I remember there was one person at the tennis club who was just encouraging. And, I feel like maybe I kept playing because she was there and telling me it doesn't matter that you're not any good. And I will remember her welcoming me. And it really meant something to me. But I have done the same thing for other people and not really even realized that I was doing it or thought about how it would have the exact same effect on them that it probably did to have that person for me. And so there's been a couple of occasions where people have come up to me and said, when I joined this school or when I joined this orchestra, I really appreciated you coming up and welcoming me. And I'm like, I don't even remember doing that, So I think it's just not something we think about. And maybe that's okay. I think if kindness is sort of baked into the systems and procedures, that doesn't mean it's not kind, right? We have to sort of design it in, and that's coming from a place of kindness. But anyway, I am a little bit off topic, but I hope that sort of answered your question.
And I think it actually ties in beautifully to my second question, which is, do you think people actually, again, I always say, and part of the challenge with conferences even like this is that we're preaching to the converted in many cases, the people who believe in it already. My little tip of the hat to, oh my God, Ted Lasso, the Ted Lasso show. I think oftentimes those that are in. We do it naturally. It comes, from the heart, and it comes unconsciously because we know what it does for us. But do you think people really, what percentage of the population do you think really understand the value of social connection to their happiness, their health, their longevity, the impact they have on other people? How far do we have to go to get this to be not just Gillian Sandstrom and Pete Bombachi and the people that are going to watch this today, but to get everybody to recognize we are all part of the solution to the disconnected world we're in?
I wish I knew the answer to that.
I feel like we need the thermometer here that has, in Canada, 38 million, and we've got one more person today who's now conscious. Let's keep going up.
I guess the one thing that sort of keeps me going in this and all aspects of life is thinking about the little things adding up to something bigger, right? And I think Mother Teresa said something along the lines of, we can't do great things, but we can do small things with a lot of love, And so I think this is one of those things where, you know, if a bunch of us start doing this little thing, then I think I have to believe that we can change the norm, you know, that if people see it and they say, oh, okay, it is okay to just go up to a stranger and say hello. And, you know, I see that person on the bus talking to the person sitting next to them. If we could make that normal rather than what is going on? Who is that weirdo? What are they doing? The more of us that are doing it, the more, you know, we're going to be able to shift it and have it seen as a normal thing to do. So yeah, I mean, there is strength in numbers, and I'd like to think that, you know, just inspiring one person to give it a try has value. That's what keeps me going.
Well, my friend, that is what keeps the light shining bright at the Gen Well Project. If I didn't believe we couldn't change the world one conversation at a time, then we wouldn't still be here, because that's our belief as well. We all have to, all of a sudden I'm using the word believe over and over again, but we got to believe, because if we don't, you know, we have a lot of challenges ahead. All right. So in your research, you talked about, you know, you focused on strangers because that's actually, you know, your area of focus in your research. But I was curious, because you said you kind of took the other components and put them to the side because that wasn't it. But when you talked about the kindness through social connection, did you find that it was more like when people reported being kind through social connection, I'm assuming it was more frequent with family and friends and people that they knew versus strangers? And then what was the delta between those two? Like, how often do we feel kind with strangers versus how often do we tend to be kind through social connection with people we know?
Well, Pete, I'm going to give people a little behind the scenes here. So Pete did send me a list of questions before this conversation, and he had lots of questions after watching my talk. But I didn't quite understand that that's what you were getting at, Pete. But I did look at some numbers for you to answer this question. So I looked specifically, so in the kindness test that we did, we asked people about the last act of kindness that someone did for them, like the last time they received an act of kindness, and who was it that did the thing, what did they do, where were you, all this kind of stuff. So I didn't look at the numbers for the who, but strangers accounted for about 10% of the acts that people recorded. I don't remember what the number was for something like weak ties versus strong ties. I mean, mostly the acts came from close others, you know, close friends and family and romantic partners. But what I did look at in response to what I thought was your question is we asked people about different kinds of acts of kindness. And we drew upon the research on social support, which kind of has these different classes of things that we tend to do to provide support to others. So we asked people, did it involve saying something? So that's kind of like emotional support. Did it involve giving people something, doing something for someone? So that would be like carrying the heavy bag or whatever, or providing information. So that could be advice or, you know, that kind of thing. And so I look specifically at the saying, and overall, in terms of like, regardless of who the person was who was doing the act of kindness, about 40% of the time, the act of kindness that people remembered, the one that's most recent, was someone saying something. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think we think of kindness as doing something, but 40% of the time it involves someone saying something to you. But it was much higher for strong ties and weak ties. For strangers, it was about 25% of the acts of kindness from strangers involved saying something. And I think that's probably because the norm is we don't talk to strangers, right? So so it took a little bit of a hit. But for weak ties and strong ties, it was about 40% of the time.
Yeah, I think the combination of we don't talk to strangers and we're not even conscious of how important a few words can be. You know, that combination. I know that I just saw a couple of weeks ago, there was a new study came out about the simple act of texting somebody, texting a friend can make a massive impact on people. So, you know, again, all these little, and to your point earlier, this is, if we can educate people to make one more action, you know, I know that our research in Canada showed that if you talk to a stranger once a week, you triple your likelihood of being happy. And to me, we should be broadcasting this at every media outlet.
How easy is that, right?
Exactly. It makes us happier and them. Why aren't we all doing this thing? But, you know, your story of your dad is hilarious when he was in the boat and met your teacher's, father, uncle, whatever the case may be.
My dad has so many stories like that.
Well, and it's, I think we all have, I think we all had those parents. Well, maybe we all didn't have those parents, but I too had that parent. Why do you think we've always made fun of the people who actually, spoke to strangers? Like I remember it didn't matter who the cashier was, what store we were in. And I have a deaf sister, and unfortunately she can't communicate that same way. And I've seen, it work the opposite way. When somebody doesn't communicate to a cashier with a thank you or something, people get angry. But why do you think we value the people that are those leaders, that have those conversations with other people?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, just answering specifically about my dad, I mean, I often felt kind of embarrassed about it. I think because I wouldn't have felt comfortable approaching a stranger and having a conversation. So the fact that he was doing it, like I knew even then as a kid that the norm was like, you don't do that, right? Like I knew that my dad was being unusual in doing this. And it was just inconvenient, because going to the grocery store would take 3 times longer than it needed to because he had to stop and talk to everybody, right? I'm like, Dad, I just want to go home. But having said that, at the same time, I could see how much my dad was enjoying himself. I could see how much the people he was talking to were enjoying themselves, so I did sort of see it as this skill that he had that I thought I definitely didn't have, and I didn't think I would ever have, but here I am now. So like I think it was kind of a combination. So there was this embarrassment, but also sort of being impressed, and it was useful sometimes. Like if we're sitting at a table at a restaurant, we need another chair. Well, Dad, you go talk to people and get us a chair. Or we're waiting in a line somewhere and we don't know what's going on. Dad, go talk to someone and find out what's happening. Like we could always send Dad off to do stuff. And now I can do those things myself. And it's really valuable sometimes to have that. So I could see value in many ways, but at the same time, I knew that it wasn't what you're supposed to do.
So let me ask you this then. You are our case study for today. So Gillian, did you start to do this because you were educated on it? Or dare I say you aged well, and we age into this concept of, hey, there's a great opportunity in talking to strangers? Because the root of this question really stems like, if this is so important and we know it adds to our well-being, as you highlighted in the research, how come we aren't really talking? We do talk about kindness, but again, I don't know if we educate people on the social connection aspect. So what do you think was it because you learned about it, or was it because you got older?
I'm gonna pick option C. It was an accident.
It was an accident.
I think after what I'm going to tell you in a second, looking back and seeing, thinking about my dad and reflecting, and, I learned a lot from watching him do it. So I think having seen my dad do it so masterfully helped me sort of gain the skills a little faster, because I, could automatically see that, maybe this did have a lot of potential, but it was really an accident. So I talked in my talk, I think about the lady with the cupcake.
Yep.
So that happened. And that was just a moment where, like, I feel like you can't help but talk to strangers. I talked to strangers before that moment, right? But that's like the first time I remember deliberately reaching out rather than just someone reaching out to me and it's sort of happening because of the situation. Like that was the first time I could remember sort of deliberately reaching out. But then there was also, I did my master's degree at Ryerson University. That's what it used to be called, now Toronto Metropolitan University. And I sort of developed this relationship with a lady who worked at the hot dog stand. And I would walk past her regularly and just smile and say hello. And I realized how good it made me feel. Like it just sort of grounded me and made me feel like, like maybe I was going to be okay. Like and it felt like a big thing to be going back and doing a master's degree. And somehow the hot dog lady made it better. So it was sort of a combination of things. It was like that accidental, and again, I mean, I didn't set out to develop a relationship with the hot dog lady. It just kind of happened. And then having this just wonderful conversation on the subway with the lady with the cupcake. So like those two things together, and then, you know, putting that together with the experience I'd seen with my dad, that just sort of motivated me to, I just realized how good it made me feel. And it made me want to understand, you know, is it just me? And how do I, you know, how can I do more of this? And yeah, so that's kind of what started it for me. And then I had to sort of train myself to be able to do it. Like, I really do feel like I had to develop some skills, and through practice and through, you know, my dad's example. And I had to start by just making eye contact with people. Like I had gotten into the habit of just feeling uncomfortable, even looking someone in the eye. I would look at people and then put the eyes to the floor. And so that the first step was just me trying to train that out of myself. But it was definitely a journey. So I think, you know, social skills, the word skill, I mean, it's something that you develop, and maybe some people are sort of born with, you know, a little bit more skilled in the first place, but it comes with practice and, you know, intention. And I believe everybody can get better and more comfortable at it.
I know Dr. Steve Jordans, who's one of our scientific advisors, would be all over that conversation, which is, you know, we can go in, what we do at GenWell now, we're doing a lot of education in schools and in workplaces about the importance of social connection. But one of the things he's big on is that you have to then give them the opportunity to try it. Because,
and I mean, I tried to emphasize that in my talk, that, you know, having one positive conversation, it's not enough, because it's easy to sort of write that off as an exception. So it really does seem, even though it's really scary, that you have to keep doing it to really get the benefits.
And whether it's in the workplace or campuses, I think they really make a great microcosm of the world, which is, you know, if I've got 50 people in an office and we educate everybody on the power of connecting with each other, or 1,000 people on a campus or in a dormitory, or, you know, pick your microcosm, when we give everybody in that room the same information and we give them permission to talk to each other, I think it really gives people the opportunity to go, oh, and we have hats that we have heads up, because our message is, to your point, literally lift your head up is the step to make eye contact. And I love the research on that. Yeah. And I used to run the Movember campaign here in Canada. And, you know, that mustache was the talking point. And so our heads up toques and baseball caps are intended to be that, which is, if I see you wearing my heads up cap, then I know that you've been educated on the power of human connection. So we're trying to prompt people into that practice that I think can help them move forward.
I love it, because I heard the word permission in there. And I think that's a really important thing. I think because the norms aren't that we talk to people, I think people feel like they need permission to do it. And so, you know, sometimes they can invent the permission, right? Like, you know, you can see someone wearing a t-shirt and you can think, okay, I have a reason to talk to them. I'm asking them about their t-shirt. But I think we kind of feel like we need that permission. And so the fact that you're giving people a way to feel like they have permission is important.
Yeah, trust me, this hat creates many conversations. I'm a collector of old NHL logoed baseball caps. And I do it for two reasons. A, I love hockey. But number two is the number of conversations, or even, I remember being in Australia and I had a baseball cap from the Texas Longhorns. And somebody was like, go Longhorns. And I'm like, I think it's a football team. I know it's a football team. But it was the color and the logo of the Longhorn, but it was a great conversation starter. And I think we can all help people, even in, you know, providing these little tools that can help people break that bridge, so that, hey, Gillian, how are you? Nice hat. What's going on? You know, whatever it might be.
Absolutely.
I know you don't have a lot of time left, so
I was gonna say, I gotta go.
I'm gonna ask, I got one more question for you.
Okay.
So we talked about the benefits. We talk about, you know, you talked about wellness. You talked about better mood, trust. What are the many other benefits that come from, you know, talking to strangers that, you know, people aren't quite aware of right now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember. I recorded the talk a couple days ago, and I have a terrible memory. So I don't remember if I talked about learning, but there is like a new paper that came out this year showing how people learn a lot more than they expect to. And I've seen that. I did a study with cross-generational conversations, and those in particular involve more learning. But I think that's sort of, I don't know. It feels related, but not exactly the same as my story about the riding an ostrich, right? Like that's not something I needed to learn.
Yeah.
So there's learning that like helps you in some way, but there's also just novelty, right? Like
Yeah.
the fact that that person taught me about people riding ostriches, and then more recently, a stranger who heard my talk sent me a little message and said, you know, Gillian, there's a town in South Africa that's famous, like ostrich jockeys is a thing. There's this whole town, and so I learned something more about ostriches. I'm going to be an ostrich expert soon. But you know, I think it brings a sense of novelty, and I think that's why it can be really scary too, right? Talking to strangers, you don't know what's going to happen. So I want to reassure people that generally nothing bad's going to happen, and if you're lucky, something really fun and, you know, the unexpected might happen. And I think that's one of the benefits of doing it. So a lot of times it might be just kind of average, but that's good too, because you're building up the skills and building up that sense that people in general are okay. But every once in a while, you're gonna learn something interesting, or just have that hit of novelty that I think we were really missing during the pandemic, especially. Like every day was the same, and I think it's because we were missing the spontaneity and the unexpected.
Yeah, and I think just
that's what I think of as one of the benefits.
That sense of just connection, and that you're not alone in this big old world, and those conversations add up over the course of time. By the way, that ostrich riding, I'm pretty sure it's in Alice Springs, Australia, and the only reason I know that is I toured through as a backpacker when I was 24 years old.
Google Australia now too.
Yeah, there you go. Gillian, I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you for recording your presentation. Thank you for the Q&A. You know, as the senior lecturer in psychology of kindness, you know, you're over there.
Best job title ever.
Yeah, no question. At the University of Essex, although a naturally born Canadian.
I'm at the University of Sussex now.
Oh, sorry, at Sussex. My apologies. It is so great to have somebody in your space as part of the Canadian Human Connection Conference. And I know that this is the start of many more conversations, because I think the work you do in educating and empowering the world around the power of speaking to strangers and connecting with people is so important for us to share. So thank you so much. And I know you got places to go, so I'll say goodbye and we'll connect at another time.
So nice to see you. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this.
Yeah, cheers, Gillian. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.